Welcome back for episode number 2. I am your humble host, Jonah Schultz. Reminder, you can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, and many, many more wherever you get your podcast. Check us out on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, True Social, YouTube, at Man in the Arena PC, and make sure you are hitting that subscribe button on YouTube. That's the only place you can find our video podcast. This is Man in the Arena.
Tear down this wall. I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
As Ronald Reagan said 60 years ago, this is a time for choosing. Every election of my lifetime has been called the most important election in American history, and maybe this one is, maybe it isn't. But one thing I can say for certain is that this election will tell us more about ourselves than maybe any other before it. Many will focus on this election in terms of policy and legislation. What are the plans and propositions of the candidates? And while that is a perfectly noble and reasonable expectation of what an election ought to be about, this presidential contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris was never going to be about policy. If this campaign boiled down to logic, reason, and policy, would a woman whose greatest achievement is sleeping with Willie Brown and whose most notable policy initiative is giving illegal immigrants a cell phone app to make their invasion more convenient, would that person win a single state? Whoever wins this election, it won't be because of their economic plan or their social positions. This election is about how the American people, you and I, view ourselves and how we believe we ought to live our lives. We were once a nation that embraced greatness. We embraced truth. We embraced virtue. That is why we produced heroic, larger-than-life politicians, George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, Davy Crockett, men who strove for greatness in every daring endeavor, men whose strength and courage were renowned, whose feats of body and mind have echoed through eternity. Who can we really say we are now? A nation led by a decrepit dementia patient who has a dim-witted floozy void of any discernible talent or intellect looking to replace him? Our halls of Congress are packed with charlatans and grifters who hold no loyalty to those they are sworn to serve. We may moan and lament over how far we've fallen, but in the end, we will only have ourselves to blame, because in a republic or any form of democracy, the government is a reflection of its own people. This election is a decision of who we want to be as Americans. Will we return to an age and an idea of greatness, of living life in accordance with what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful? Will we strive to live out a life of virtue and craft a nation that seeks to serve something greater than ourselves? Will we choose liberty over licentiousness? Will we once again believe in manifest destiny and a rugged pursuit of prosperity and purpose? These are the questions that are before us. Donald Trump is not the answer to all of these questions, and he certainly is not a solution to all of our problems. But with our help, he may be that starting block with which a once great nation can launch a revival like has never been seen before. This is the choice we have in front of us. This is a choice that you have in front of you. But like any important decision, it starts with you. How you decide to live your life, how you decide to attack your obstacles, how you decide to lift up those around you, and how you decide the United States of America will not go quietly into darkness and despair. Now let's get into today's calibration. All right, we are back today on the panel with Ken Hendrickson Jr.
How you doing?
Great. Came back for episode number 2. So we haven't been booted off any platform yet. So I'd say we're off to a very, very solid start.
That's what we're after.
Yeah. So I spent the monologue portion talking to the folks here about who we are as a nation, who we are right now, who we were, and who we are going to be moving forward. And I think there is a clip that's been circulating, many clips have been circulating, of Kamala Harris went on a podcast recently called Call Her Daddy. Now, if you're not familiar with Call Her Daddy, then good for you. You've done a great job avoiding it. If you are familiar with it, I'm sorry. But it is a podcast that is essentially what the name would suggest. It's a very sexualized, female-driven podcast. Now, this is a family show, and we're going to always strive to be very clean on the show, keep things available for all ages. But if you have children watching right now, I would just maybe put it on mute for this quick clip that we're going to play. Just a few seconds off of a Call Her Daddy recent episode. We're going to play it for you right now.
How do you work with the balls and the asshole on a man?
The balls, like, it really depends on the guy. Like, some guys don't like it. Yeah. Some have less sensitivity and you can tug on them. Yes. Put them all in your mouth. Yeah. Like, some guys are like, fuck. Yeah, it hurts whenever you try to do it.
All right, we're going to cut it right there because I think that paints a good enough picture for you about what this podcast is about. Now, Ken, are you a big fan of Call Her Daddy before I get into what I need to say?
No, I mean, I'm not necessarily a fan. I mean, I understand I understand, at least in terms of culture, kind of where it sits. It's obviously a popular podcast.
It's
Spotify and SiriusXM have paid a lot of money to have the rights to this podcast, so it's one that's well listened to.
Yeah,
but I don't consider myself an avid listener.
Okay, yeah, they recently signed a $125 million deal with Sirius,
massive.
I believe. Yeah, and they're, I think at one point they were the number 2 podcast on Spotify. So enormous podcast, enormous following, specifically among young women, obviously. And Kamala Harris, from a political aspect, I understand why she went on the show. I understand that the entire pitch, you can go back and watch this episode if you really want to put yourself through that. The majority of the episode was spent on abortion and women's rights, obviously, talking about how we can give women easier access to kill unborn children. But in this case, I really want to focus about what this signals. What does this mean by a presidential candidate going on a podcast like this? Because this podcast, what it is, it's a sex podcast. It's a podcast that essentially, is very pushing of young women to be promiscuous, to yield sex as a weapon, to, it's a lot of dating advice that's probably not the best dating advice if you want to have healthy relationships. But we used to, I talked about this in this episode, to open up this episode, about how we once considered ourselves a respectful people, a proud nation, a nation of people who did great things. And our leaders are supposed to be a reflection of that, right? They're supposed to be a reflection of how we as individuals should aspire to be, right? That's the goal. That's certainly not been the case throughout history. There's been many people who have come short, but we've at least tried to give the illusion of that in the past, right? We've at least tried to give the illusion of, hey, this person who leads our nation is a great, strong, virtuous individual, even if they weren't, right? That was at least the illusion that was tried to be created, which I think is important, that was at least a bar that we strove towards. But now it seems that the people that, like Kamala Harris, who is a coin toss to be the next president of the United States, is going on a podcast where they discuss this type of content. to me, what that signals to our people is that we are really a nation that doesn't take itself seriously anymore and is in serious decline.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you see, like with this in particular, is there's this radical desire to redefine feminism and liberal politics, because it's a well-known fact that, like, when you speak, the platform of the left and the ideas and the ideals of the left, they're not necessarily popular. Which is why there aren't a bunch of liberal talk show hosts that do really well, like on these platforms or even in traditional media. It's why Fox News is the behemoth that it is, and CNN and MSNBC pick up their scraps. And we've seen a number of iterations of kind of these feminist podcasts and feminist media, and it's just so darn unpopular. Mm-hmm. It's unpopular first with men, and it's not resonating with women, at least in the long run. It's not sustainable. There's been flashes in the pan here and there where these were good podcasts or good shows for a minute and had an audience. But eventually, like, the more they talk, the more you unmask what is behind, like, today's feminism. And it's just not popular. So I think that's the first thing that's going on. But I think the other thing that's going on too is, I think the alternative media, this kind of media, is a threat to traditional media. And so I think that's where there's been almost the largest outcry from this, is from traditional media groups that would love to have Kamala Harris on their show. And she's doing call her daddy. But yeah, I mean, I think this is just another attempt at kind of like trying to redefine feminism, trying to make it palatable. And to, their credit, like, they have a top rated show right now. But is this something that's going to be popular 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, in the same way that, like, Joe Rogan is? I don't know.
Well, I think what's interesting is, obviously, you look at polling data, and for young women, specifically young single women, are a huge voting base for the Democrat Party. Huge. When you get into married women, it's really interesting because the gender divide is very pronounced, especially in this election, with men skewing pretty hard towards Trump and women skewing pretty hard towards Harris. But if you break it down by single women and married women on average, over 50% of married women vote Republican. But when you go into single women, you get close to 70% of single women who vote Democrat. And that's very interesting because you look at these type of podcasts and these type of movements within our politics and within the feminist movement specifically. Every single one of these movements has accomplished nothing but make women more miserable, right? And that's backed up by, it's not just anecdotal, but I think we've all experienced it. But it's backed up by polling data. You look at the mental illness rate among young women under 30, women under 40, it's enormous, the mental illness rate. It's bigger than any other demographic of single women. You look at the rates of depression and anxiety. You look at the self-reported rates of "Are you happy?" Right? Single women are the least happy group in the United States, and I think it goes to things like this, where what are we encouraging them to do, right? Because in the past, and I'm not saying anything was ever perfect, but in the past we used to encourage women to do things that I believe made them happy, make people happy at large, right? I'm a person who's 29 years old. I'm married now. I've been single in the past and only got married within the last couple years. So I understand what it's like to be on both sides of the spectrum. And there is nothing more fulfilling than finding somebody that you deeply love and care about, having a child that just becomes the center of your universe. And those most fulfilling, important duties and joys that we have in life are being, portrayed to these women as burdens, as shackles. And now it's really coming from our top individuals like Kamala Harris, who, right, is a childless woman, right, who kind of fits into this demographic in many ways. And ultimately, we're leading, in this case, young women to a joyless, purposeless life, which is, I think, ultimately the biggest tragedy of what this signals.
Oh, and that's Democrat politics, right? I mean, there's nothing fulfilling about left-wing politics. It's championing abortion and independence for the sake of independence. You don't need to be with a man. You just need to be alone, and women and girl power and girl boss and all these like cliche things, as opposed to, again, the things that are traditional in this country aren't bad, but they're trying to turn them into bad things.
Right.
It's that we want to do the opposite just for the sake of the opposite. And at the end of the day, those aren't fulfilling livelihoods. I mean,
right.
Sure, there are some women that enjoy just the grind and want to have a family, and they want to have a business, and they want to run a business, and that's fine. But by and large, like biologically, genetically, like this is how the whole world has kind of evolved. In pairs together. And now we want to run away from that just for the sake of running away from it.
Yeah, and I think that's the big tragedy of our age, of our lifetime, certainly, is in many areas, we've thrown out thousands of years of human wisdom for this temporary pleasure-based gain. And I think ultimately it's sad because you're not even trading this for joy or for happiness or for making yourself happy. You're trading the things that universally humans knew made us happy and fulfilled. You're trading those things to just be more depressed, more anxious, and eventually look back with regret when you realize that you're past the point of being able to have those things. And that's what I think is driving so much of this divide between men and women, because you have so many women who are being pushed in one direction, and then they're kind of flabbergasted when they're like, well, I can't find anybody who wants to fit into this life with me, when the reality is, we have had an understanding of how men and women operate for so long, and instead of saying, okay, there's things that men do that probably aren't right in society, right, for a long time, instead of just saying, okay, we need to figure out how we can behave, we just went so far to opening things up through the sexual revolution, and the only tangible result has been misery, has been single motherhood, has been a childless or a fatherless rate, a single parent rate like we've never seen before in the history of humanity.
Well, and it's funny too, because again, I'm not an avid listener of this podcast, but you see reels and shorts of podcasts like this one in particular, and I often see these ones where these girls are, what are you looking for in a man? Well, he's got to make $150,000 a year. He's got to be 6'2". He's got to have a sports car and a nice house and a vacation house. And they have sometimes guys on that play the foil to that, and they're kind of like, well, what are you bringing to the table? And it's like, right now, you're young and pretty, but what do you bring to the table 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Because what they've signed up for, to your point, is basically to be a team player in hollow politics. Yeah. And that's all. That's as fulfilling as it gets. I'm doing my part. After that, nothing else comes.
Right. And I think then there's this shock for so many women when they get to a certain age, and they're like, hold on, I'm either married to a person and I'm miserable with that person because I married them for the wrong reasons, or I'm single, I'm a childless cat lady, right? And I'm miserable because now I can't have kids, or I can't find somebody that wants to settle down with me, or any of these things. And this isn't to heap on women. Men have driven this problem in many ways by being, we have this whole like alpha mindset now, and this whole like male sigma thing where it's like, just go out and get laid as much as possible and make as much money as you can and treat women like garbage. What came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. It really doesn't matter. The point is, when these two things exist, this is the result that you're seeing in society, which is a loneliness epidemic with men. It's a depression epidemic with women. And then it becomes a cycle.
Well, it's like anything else, right? The answer lies in the middle, right? I think that the kind of today's feminism and then the alpha maleism was one or the other, like you said, chicken or egg, I don't know, but they're a response to each other. When the solution is somewhere in the middle, like if we can each step back and start to value each other as humans and build a relationship, like that's where fulfillment is. Yeah, and
I think it's important to kind of look at people like, I think Andrew Tate's a great example, because somebody who's incredibly popular among young men. There's people like this woman, I call her Daddy, that are extremely popular among young women. And maybe you could make the argument that people like Andrew Tate, what they're doing is they're pointing out a lot of problems that are real problems, right? So their diagnosis of the problem is accurate, but their solution is not, right? And I think that's where so many people have gone astray and I talk about my generation all the time of how people really know something's wrong, but they're being fed all of the wrong solutions, and they're listening to all the wrong solutions, and ultimately it's ruining their lives even more so. And I think that that's ultimately, to just bring it back to the point of Kamala Harris going on this show, is what does this signal to young women about how they should live our lives? Because like I said, our politicians, like it or not, are always an example to us of how one ought to live, how one ought to live morally. And when you give this signal to young women that this is a person we're going to promote, these are positions, these are values that we're going to promote, to me, that is even more important than any kind of policy Kamala Harris has, is the signal to how people should behave without any kind of laws or policy.
Yeah, I mean, she's regardless of what you think about Kamala Harris, she's an immediate role model.
Yeah.
I mean, for young women everywhere, policy or not, party or not, like, because of where she sits in American politics, she's somebody that young women are going to look to for answers. Yeah,
absolutely. And with that, I want to shift into, as we stay on the topic of depression and anxiety that we just talked about a lot, shift into a topic that is very touchy, and I don't think it is politicized in the way that you would find polling data in support of. But I think for a lot of people, it's something that has entered their lives in different ways of how they've thought about this. And there's this clip going around through the BBC. They interviewed this woman who is a Canadian euthanasia and abortion doctor. And I just want to play the first minute of this just so you can get a sense of this woman and what's going on here.
Hello. Thank you for seeing me. You too. Should we do hands and whatever? Are we very formal? Or do we not? I don't know.
We don't need to be formal, but we also don't need to touch hands.
Fine, good. So you do this work actually here sometimes?
Most people want to die in their own homes.
Yeah.
And so I would be in their home. And of course, many people are in hospital, in hospice, in care homes. And then there are people who don't feel comfortable dying at home. For example, they don't want their spouse to have to deal with their memory of them dying in their home. So then they come here, and this is a recliner. And so people recline here, and they can snuggle up with their loved ones if they want. And so it's a good place for some people. Mm-hmm.
So this clip, it struck me for a number of reasons. To me, it's very spooky, the discussion that they are having. And I want to put this in perspective, first through some statistics of what's going on, and then through my personal, I think it's important to relate kind of my personal perspective on this. And in Canada, you are seeing deaths, medically assisted deaths, or what they call in the technical term, absolutely skyrocketing over the years that it's been legalized over there broadly. And it's being legalized across Europe and many states here now in the United States. In the past year, there were over 13,241 medically assisted deaths, euthanasia, in Canada. 4.1% of all deaths in that year were via euthanasia. And in 2021, they no longer required the clause of needing, quote, reasonably foreseeable death. So in the past, the argument always was, well, if somebody is dying of cancer, right, and they have a few months to live and they're really struggling, they're in pain, they're in misery, we're going to come in and make that person comfortable and essentially just move up the timeline of them leaving this earth. Now we are getting into the time where we have waived those clauses. We're now talking more and more about individuals with mental illness. And in Belgium, there was a 9 and 11-year-old who were euthanized. There's an individual, Noah Povin, who's a 17-year-old with mental illness who was euthanized in Belgium. And to me, when you start talking about children, and I want to back up maybe first of all and say that I think most people, and Ken, you can probably speak to this, give me your opinion on this. I think most people, when you look at euthanasia and you look at terminally ill cancer patients, you can sympathize with the longing and where that policy even comes from to a certain extent. I think all of us can sort of empathize with that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for someone who's watched more people die than I would have liked to at this point in my life, like, end of life is not a pretty thing.
No.
It's not easy. It's not easy for, obviously those that are going through it. It's not easy for the family. And in the months and days leading up to that, it's often not pretty. You often lose, any sort of quality of life. You lose the ability to, have autonomy over your own body to do basic things, like take care of yourself, to go to the bathroom and things. So there's a lot that is ugly and awful about end of life, and there's really no way to make that easier. And so, euthanasia is the one way that I think, lets people have some sort of sense of dignity when leaving this earth. I think in principle, I think I would agree. Like, I'm a pretty openly, I don't know, I'm a staunch advocate for it, but I'm more pro euthanasia than I am against it. But I think it's like anything else, it comes down to how you regulate it. Certainly I don't think any of us want to deny people that are literally nearing end of life, that are terminally ill, that are in pain every day, that have have lost their own dignity and feel that way, the ability to exit on their own terms.
Yeah.
And but I think especially in Canada right now, what you've seen is kind of opening this up to mental illness, which really broadens the spectrum of who is eligible, I guess, for their MAID program.
Yeah. And so what I want to do is give my personal perspective before I give my broader perspective on this issue. And so, when my mom passed away from cancer a few years ago, it was a process that, like everybody who has lost loved ones in one way or another, it is a very eye-opening, traumatizing event, right? We talk about trauma a lot in society. Those are the events that are really, truly stick with you in many ways, unfortunately. But my mother was the center of our lives in many ways. She was just our best friend. She was an incredible singer, a gardener, incredible cook, just was a woman of many, many talents who I miss every single day. When we were going through the process, it was probably, it went on for a couple of years, and we got to about a 6-month point where it was like, this is not turning around. And it was really the last few months where things really began to snowball and, like you said, get very difficult in terms of quality of life. When you have that person who's suffering and you have the loved ones who are watching this person just rapidly lose weight, not be able to move, not be able to do the things that they love, that they're just suffering. And it's a horrible, horrible thing to have to go through, to have to watch. And I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And there were knowing my mom, there were probably many times throughout that process that if she had the option to do something like this, she would have taken it. And she even said to us at the time, like, please, pray that God takes me tonight, because this is unbearable. And those are very difficult things to go through. And I think it's important to give my perspective on this, my story on this, because I can really sympathize with people who might reach for something like this. The reason that I don't believe you can ever have it entered the picture from a legal standpoint is because, like you said, about it comes down to regulation and all of those things. I think that that's true, but I think once you say we're going to move forward with this, you open a Pandora's box that I don't think you're able to shut. Because once you as a society say that life is not valuable from here to here, regardless of how you're putting it, our position of life as a society used to be for many, many hundreds and thousands of years, we had the position that life was valuable from the time you're born to the time you die. You're here for a purpose, and it's not known to us. It's not understood by us, but you're here for a reason. And I don't understand why my mom lingered as long as she did. There were many times I wish that she would have been able to go sooner. But as soon as you stop signaling that to your society, to your culture, you start devaluing the institution of life in and of itself. And you can get into the same thing about abortion as you do as euthanasia here. I understand from a practical matter of how you want to ease people's suffering. But also, I think what it does is it devalues life itself, because nothing is very honorable, nothing is very dignified about those last moments. But there is something about the process, and I can say from my experience with my mother that if we didn't have those last few months or last few weeks, there are conversations and a closeness and a closure that would have never been formed. And I think there's a purpose for those things, even though we may never understand them.
Yeah, no, and I understand certainly where you're coming from there. To me, as someone who is like, I generally err on the side of, when it comes to the legality of something, that I wouldn't make something illegal that you could kind of do on your own. And this is a dignified way of doing that, right? If someone is intent on ending their life, no matter counseling or anything else or people that are telling them they love them, want them to stay, is going to keep them to stay. So they're intent on taking that action. So, but again, I think you got to be really careful about who you make eligible for medically assisted intervention. And I think it's obvious. I think the one thing that's obviously true, though, is that these 13,241 people in Canada would not have killed themselves. Maybe a portion of them would have, but I think the vast majority are going to this out of a sake of convenience. But I don't want to get too much into the reason I bring this up is because I see in a lot of conservative conversations, it's always kind of like, this is terrible, this is wrong, nobody should ever consider it. But I think a lot of people have the perspective that you and I may have, where we need to talk about this in a way of understanding the pain that people go through and knowing that this is a reasonable path for the mind to go down, the mind and body to go down, from certainly from my experience and from what sounds like your experience as well. All right, I'm gonna shift gears here now and get into a topic that's probably going to be a regular topic on this show, and that's illegal immigrants, because we can't seem to find a way out of the mess that we are in. J.D. Vance, since the debate, I think, in my opinion, has really been the man of the hour in many ways. I think he's almost driving the campaign at this point, where he's the one that's out front and center on a lot of these shows, because he's really shown himself to be incredibly competent, incredibly capable. The debate was phenomenal, by the way. Yeah. That was probably one of the strong, at least in my lifetime, one of the strongest debates that I've ever seen a Republican candidate have. I think, in my opinion, certainly in my lifetime, that was the best performance that I've ever seen any individual, Republican or Democrat, give in a debate. I thought the structure of the debate was really good. I thought the moderators were terrible. But I thought they were able to stay on topic relatively well. And it wasn't. Well, I think once JD called them out, it seemed to improve a little. Yeah, there, because he was like, "I'm not going to play your games." Yeah, and I think he's just so. And you had that whole period of time when JD Vance got picked to be the VP, where there was that media blitz, where obviously they all got the memo of, "Oh, this guy's weird, this guy's awkward, this guy's this and that," and as any kind of logical person, you had to say, "This guy can't be really that weird," because he's got obviously a lovely functioning family. He's been very successful in multiple avenues of life. And so I think for a lot of people, when they watched that debate, they were like, wait a second, this guy's not weird. This guy, this guy makes a lot of sense. He's charismatic. He's capable. He's got a great beard. I mean, like those piercing eyes, just gave all the memes of his eyes, and it was hilarious. And Tim Walz, I said for Tim Walz, Tim Walz, you could really hop on him because he was so clearly outmatched.
I thought he did a relatively decent job, all things considered, because I've kind of put it this way. If you're Tim Walz, your job in that scenario is Kamala Harris is standing in front of a burning building with a can of gasoline, and you have to convince everybody there that she's not the one who set it on fire, right? So you're automatically in this hole where you have indefensible positions, indefensible policies, and you're trying to pretend that things are good, but we need change, so they're actually bad. So we need to get back in there, but we're already there. So there's this whole circular train of logic that he has to navigate. So all things considered, he did okay.
Well, I think the thing is that you could see that in his body language.
Yeah.
Because they're asking the questions and he knows he doesn't have a position to stand on. So his eyes and his face are going.
Yeah. And I think he actually exposed through his body language. There's so many politicians like him, I believe, that they don't believe in anything that they are talking about.
I think he was so over-prepared with cliches and answers that's why he looked a little frazzled and disheveled at times.
Yeah, and so ultimately when you're looking at the debate, you're looking at who is the guy here who's the intelligent, capable one. If you're just scrolling through Twitter as a normal person or scrolling the news, you've been told all this time that Tim Walz is the dad that everybody wished they had, and he's the normal hunting guy. He coached football at the high school and all these different things. And J.D. Vance is the weirdo hillbilly who, is awkward around people. We're not talking about Tim Walz starting the gay club at his high school that he taught at, which is really, really weird. We're talking about how J.D. Vance. I don't even want to get into all the stuff that was said because that's a whole nother thing. But I thought, like you said, incredible job by J.D. Vance, and there's a lot of people out there that I spoke to and that you probably have all seen online where people are starting to say, I wish J.D. Vance was at the top of the ticket.
Oh, I said it that night. Yeah.
And if he continues in this direction, people will probably get their wish in 2028 or beyond, if he continues to impress like he has. But I'm always very hesitant to really heap massive praise upon politicians because Mike Pence used to be the conservative darling, and you look at him now and he's one of the most hated figures on the right. So I always try to put the caveat of this is right here, right now. We don't know what J.D. Vance can be like in 2 years or 2 months or any of those things, but as of right now, he's just doing a heck of a job.
Fair enough. Yeah. And my final thought just on the debate too is just going back to body language, where it almost seemed like JD would give an answer that was succinct, concise, to the point, covered all the topics, covered all the areas, covered all the ground that he wanted to cover. And then he would stop and he would almost kind of smile to himself.
Yeah.
Like, damn, I'm good.
Yeah.
Like, that was at least my take of like his body language. Like, he would answer a question and be like, man, I am just, this is mine. I am so good at this.
And I think that his performance moving forward and his value as a figure in many regards is something that's very valuable to society, because specifically for men and young men, there's not very many role models to look up to, especially in politics. Donald Trump has been a person that, man, he's been extremely successful. Obviously, he's had his personal life where he's been, a well-known womanizer. He
was a Democrat for a long time.
Yeah. So in his defense, right? In his defense, he's been Democrat. He was a Democrat for a long time, but somebody who's had an imperfect life, like all of us have, and made mistakes and all those different things. But if I was sitting, if I had a young boy, my child, and I would sit them down and say, who do I want that child to be like? I wouldn't necessarily say Donald Trump, right? I would say, I'd love for you to have the grit and determination of Donald Trump. I'd love for you to have that drive to be successful like Donald Trump. But there's certain things I wouldn't want him to emulate. But when I saw somebody like J.D. Vance up there and what he's accomplished in his life and kind of what he just symbolizes at this point, I saw somebody that could be a real inspiration to men who are increasingly needing a purpose of like, hey, here's a guy with a beautiful family, beautiful children, who's been successful as a writer, has had a movie made about his life, has been successful in tech, in business, and politics, obviously, and somebody who doesn't back down when he's got a 3-on-1 debate going on. So I thought everything he did was a great encouragement to a lot of people who are you look at people throughout the primary season, the vast majority of voters did not want Trump or Biden. That's just a statistical fact, but that's what we wound up getting. A lot of people are looking for what can that vision be for the future, and I think for the first time, myself, I saw somebody who could present a legitimate vision for what this country could look like post Donald Trump, post Biden Harris.
Yeah. Yeah, post MAGA republicanism.
Yeah, so
I didn't mean to throw the
no, not at all. No, I think that's important to touch on. So JD Vance has been really now. I think the campaign has this confidence in him. He's shown himself to be incredibly capable. He's, like I said, kind of been the man of the hour, and he was at this event in Michigan where it was a rally, and he was talking about the fact, and this was a new statistic to me, and he said that just the day before or that day he had learned of this fact. But in Michigan schools, there are 85,000 children of illegal immigrants in the Michigan public school system. 85,000. I don't think I need to tell anybody why that's a problem, but let's take a step back and paint a broader picture. In Detroit, in the city of Detroit, the literacy rate among adults, not just children, adults, 47%, meaning that over half of the people who live in the city of Detroit cannot read. In the schools, 13.5% read at grade level. Just 5% in 2023. So that makes me a little bit skeptical of that 13.5% that we almost tripled the literacy rate in schools in a year. I think there might be some fudging of numbers or maybe some lowering of the grade level requirements. But be that as it may, 14% are proficient in math. So in Detroit schools at large, you can safely say 80% or more of students are falling way behind of where they should be at their grade level. So I bring this up because this is happening. You can see it in Baltimore. You can see it in Cleveland. You can see it across the country. In really any city that we're falling further and further behind educationally. Think about how difficult it is to teach middle schoolers. Think about how difficult it is to wrangle a room of 9 and 10-year-olds and teach them. Now think about the fact that you could have a classroom that maybe a quarter or half of these kids can't even speak English, right? Have no understanding of your culture, have no understanding of your norms, just were rushed into this country and were thrown into school. How do you think that that's going to be handled by these teachers who obviously aren't even having success getting the native-born kids of Detroit or any of these cities up to speed where they need to be to live successful and purposeful lives? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think on the last episode we talked a lot about Springfield, Ohio, and the influx of new people to Springfield and just how that puts a strain on every system that is in the entire infrastructure of the city. Similarly, I think this puts the same kind of strain on your education system. So I do want to be careful though a little bit because I'm trying to find out. Like I've had a hard time sourcing that number. Like I don't know where JD got that number, and it very specifically says like children of illegal immigrants. So if you and I are illegal immigrants and we have a child that was born here, they would technically be a citizen. So I just want to be I just want to be careful that like I don't think we want to be the party of like demonizing children, like putting them I don't think we're demonizing children, and I think there's a reason there's a big movement to end birthright citizenship because we have all of these anchor babies right they're being put here. Sure. And it's never about demonizing the children. They are victims of the situation. It's the same thing when we talk about them coming over the border and being used as drug mules, of being abused in these situations. Yeah. It's unfortunate that they're here, right? Because they shouldn't be. Right. Like, they shouldn't be here. It's not like they made the decision.
No, I'm not pointing at a 6-year-old child of a legal immigrant and saying, this is your fault, you're a terrible person. No, but the point being that this being allowed to happen, this illegal immigration, you could just focus on the adults here. Focus on this illegal immigration boom that has happened over the years of our lives. It is having a extremely negative effect on our children. So it just comes down to what can you prioritize as a nation? Because we have limited resources, we have limited capacity in whatever we do. You as a person, us as a nation, have limited capacity and resources. Our main duty as a country, as a state, as a school system is to the kids who are essentially native to those places. And what you're doing here is you're hurting those kids. So that's really my concern, is those kids of these communities who are having their futures hurt by this absolutely irresponsible policies that allow these children to be here in the first place. It's not you terrible kids. It's these policies need to change, or you're going to continue to hurt continue to hurt more and more kids.
Yeah, and that's my other thing. Is just like there's two problems here, right? It's like the problem is illegal immigration, because we shouldn't have gotten to this point,
right?
But then the second problem is, okay, well, now you're here and you have 85,000 children in some makeup of demographics. What do you do with them? Because I mean, we also can't just tell them like you're not entitled to learn anything. You have to stay home. Like the government now here has to figure out how do we accommodate 85,000 children in the school system. And to your point, if you have 12 kids in a classroom that don't speak any English and aren't going to be able to figure out like when lunchtime is, like that's difficult. We had in my own 5th grade class, we had a legal immigrant come over. A legal immigrant, make sure I'm clear. Came from Hungary. Spoke no English. Was it's like the first day of school was an absolute like just episode trying to figure out like how we're gonna like get from point A to point B. He eventually like caught on and it was fine, and he went to school with us all the way through and it was fine. But we had one that we were trying to help along.
Yeah,
and so to have 5, 6, 10, 12 in a classroom would be very difficult for your average teacher in a city school.
Yeah, and that's increasingly becoming the case, because it's not just say immigrants at large. There's many school systems in the country where there's 10 languages being spoken in classrooms, right? So you talk about putting a burden on teachers, and I think if you look at how the classroom works, what happens in at least a modern day public school setting is that the teacher's job in many cases, unfortunately, is to get those kids to the next grade, right? There's a lot of teachers who kind of lament the fact that they're not incentivized necessarily to educate children. They're incentivized to push them on to the next grade. So in order to do that, you have to pander, you have to really structure your courses, your teachings, everything. You
have to lower the standards
to the bottom percentiles of that classroom. So those kids who are gifted or are average, those are the kids that are going to fall behind and really not get to their potential. And so that's a bad structure to have a classroom, even if it's all English-speaking American-born kids.
I was going to say, it's like even without the illegal immigration,
right?
Like our education system is already under that strain, and then you throw another problem in on top of it.
Right. So you're kind of going into the situation now where it's going to go from bad to worse, and even if you. Let's just take the position of these kids, of the illegal immigrants, they're not even going to get a good education. So there's nobody who wins in this scenario, because the kids who are the children of the native-born American citizens, they are being hurt. The 85,000 children of these illegal immigrants are being hurt because none of them are getting a good education. None of them are going to be prepared to go and live productive lives. And so this whole situation is just a recipe for poverty, a recipe for crime, a recipe for chaos, a recipe for more people out there with feeling that their lives are meaningless and being kind of feeling like everything has gone awry for them. And that's where I think the broader danger is where it always comes down to, where you have this liberal opinion of we just want to help everyone. But at a certain point, you're not helping anybody. You're just hurting somebody who otherwise would have had a good education or a good life or more affordable housing or whatever the case might be.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, so like I know no one's asking me how to fix the Michigan school system, but
they might.
I do think like at this point right now, like if we can shut it off right now, right? Turn off illegal immigration. Michigan could survive this because I think it's about distribution of the classrooms here. I think there's 1.5 million students in Michigan public schools. So this would make up about 5%. So when you think about the average classroom of 25 people, like if you could get one child into each of those classrooms. Like, that can be manageable. What's certainly not sustainable and manageable is the scenario we've laid out where there's 10, 12, 15 kids in a classroom, because all the things that we just talked about then have to, you lower your standards. It's about pushing kids through the system. And eventually they reach a point of apathy. They reach a point where they're not going to do this anymore. When they start to be old enough to make decisions for themselves, they're not going to continue to go down this path. And they just leave the school system altogether. But at least, again, no one's asking me how to fix it, but to me, that's at least a start, is like, how can we distribute what we have and make it manageable to teachers? I guarantee that won't happen in this scenario, but that's, like, to me, the only solution I see on like, how do you even accommodate something like this?
Yeah.
And the sad thing is that this is happening all over our country. And
this is one example.
And there really is no, like, whiteboard example of, like, here's how you handle it. And everybody's just going through this trying to figure it out. And it's detrimental to everybody in the end. Yeah.
And that's why, like we talked about last week, your solutions to these problems grow more and more harsh the longer you let this go on, right? So you get to the point where your only solution is to deport all of these people. And obviously that can have I would imagine, a adverse effect on a child, right? A difficult situation because they don't know what's going on, right? They didn't make the decision of, like, hey, mom and dad, I'm going to take you across the border and we're going to go do this.
They're the biggest losers here.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, why you talk about the humanitarian aspect of illegal immigration. We're always told, well, think of the children, think of the women, think of these people striving for a better life. But my position on closing the border and making sure people can't come here legally is actually the best thing for them, because you're not putting children in this position any longer. You're not exposing children to be these drug mules like they have been time and time again. You're not exposing these children to these perilous journeys where many are dying. You're not exposing children to be thrown into a school system where they can't learn and they can't. So I'm not saying any of these solutions or policies are easy or not harsh, but exactly, the children, and it's always the most vulnerable, in this case, children, who are usually the most vulnerable, who are the ones getting the short end of the deal. But that's never talked about in the humanitarian. The left pretends to be, we're humanitarians, but they don't care about these kids. If they cared about these kids, they would be putting in place policies that stop them from getting abused like they do at the southern border, and they're just not.
Well, that's what I said. Like, to solve this problem, the very first step is you have to turn it off. Like, we can't have any more. You have to turn it off
Step
first.
one.
Because in another year, that 85 becomes 120.
Yeah.
And then in another year, it becomes 165. And another year, it becomes 200,000.
Yeah.
And now I have a problem that is catastrophic for my school system.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Staying on this topic of immigrants in general, this isn't necessarily illegal immigrants, although it is wrapping in to include them at this point. NBC News, Minneapolis adds its first non-citizen police officer. This was a Somali woman. And there are other articles out there. You can go on and read them all you want. There's now movements. I'm not sure if it's law currently, but at least movements in this direction for DACA recipients who are illegal immigrants, becoming police officers in California and Colorado. There's this NBC News article. It's great because the first individual picture they show, they have a police. It's Austin, actually, Texas. They have this hat that has a bunch of rainbow colors on it and a transgender flag on there. So the state-sponsored religion is always very present, being shown. This is a problem. It's a problem when, number one, you don't have enough police officers, native-born police officers, to fill your ranks. You don't have enough citizens to fill your ranks, right? That's a problem we've talked about ad nauseum when it comes to our police officers not being treated right, the benefits not being there, feeling like they could get thrown in prison at any moment if they make the wrong split-second decision. So increasingly, there's no incentive for a lot of people to become police officers, and you're seeing these, obviously, defund the police was a huge movement, especially in Minneapolis, all these different things, and they've struggled to fill their ranks since. But it really reminds me, when I look at this situation, this Somali woman, it reminds me of actually what went on in ancient Rome. And in ancient Rome, they had to bribe their Germanic generals to go in and fight the German people, right? They essentially conquered and hired mercenaries to enforce, whether via police, whether it was in their military, and eventually this house of cards collapsed underneath its own weight. This situation is dangerous because our police officers, and I know nothing about this woman, I know nothing about her background, I know nothing about what she believes, but when you take people from a culture in a country like Somalia that is so different from ours, and then you give them authority over the people, that is a recipe for disaster. It is a recipe for resentment, it is a recipe for abuse of power, it is a recipe ultimately for chaos to break out. And I think that this is, as this continues and as we see more and more non-citizens entering our police force, we're going to see a huge backlash against this because people aren't going to trust those who are given this authority. And I think you're going to see a lot of these individuals who have this resentment towards actual citizens, like we've actually seen in the Somali community, the way that they voted, the way that they have really said, in Minneapolis with Ilhan Omar saying we're Somali first, we're American second, right? This is a dangerous, dangerous trend, and putting these people in these positions of power who are non-citizens is a very dangerous game.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it is important though that we look at the specific situations though, because I think like broadly speaking, like you're not wrong there. I do think the individuals in question here have been like long time, like lawfully permanent residents. So, and when you think about like green card holders, I think there's 20,000 or so in the United States military today. To join the military as a green card holder, I think that lessens the residency requirement before you can become a naturalized citizen. I think that was the George Bush law from 2002. And so I do think it's like before we jump in with both feet, just making sure that we do look at each situation on its individually, because if you're someone that's been here since you've been 4 years old or 10 years old and you've been living in these communities and you are a green card holder and you're doing things the right way, like that's the kind of immigration that we want, right? I mean, you may come from a different background or a different ethnicity, but those individual circumstances didn't matter. Now, again, broadly thinking about the politicians in the group and the squad and the things that these people are going out and championing every day is frightening. I mean, that's where it turns, where it's you have people that are, invested in essentially overturning American values and ideals. Yeah, and that's dangerous.
Right. So, I think the broader kind of conversation that needs to be had is when you come into a country, it's like anything else. It's you see this a lot in political movements. I speak specifically in the Republican, the conservative movement. There's always these ex-Democrats, these kind of individuals who all of a sudden they're like, oh no, I was totally wrong, or I'm going to come into this movement and now I'm a strong Republican, I'm a strong Trump supporter, I'm this, I'm that. And those are the people that the movement tends to really like lift up immediately because they're a great symbol of like, oh, people that came away from that, they don't like that. But time and time again, those are the individuals who wound up stabbing us in the back because they don't have a proven track record. They're not necessarily trustworthy. I think the same thing applies here, where there's a reason that people for thousands of years outside of the United States and in nations and empires for eternity have understood that first-generation immigrants are less likely to be loyal to their nation than third generation, fourth generation individuals. That's not always the case. That's a generalization, as most things are. But we used to understand these things as just inherently true, because if you were an individual, it's like when my great-grandfather came to America, he came over from Italy, like my entire family did at that point. they didn't speak English, right? They had to kind of work their way up in that way that you had that huge immigration influx in the early 20th century. But those individuals, they all were incentivized. They all were pushed to assimilate, obviously. But it gets to the bigger point of there's a reason that only natural-born, native-born citizens of the United States can become president of the United States, because there's a recognition that there is a difference, can be a difference in loyalty to a nation. It's like Teddy Roosevelt said, in the United States, there's only room for one language. It's English language. There's only room for one flag. He said there's no room for hyphenated Americans. You can only be a American. I think you don't have to have a distrust of immigrants. Some of I have two close friends. They're Romanian immigrants. They're big-time conservatives. They think just like me. I wish I could make them president tomorrow. Unfortunately, that will never be the case. But we also understood that you can't elevate these people at large. And again, you're talking about a specific circumstance, but this is starting to happen all over the country. And my belief is it's just going to be an absolute recipe for disaster as we are getting more and more immigrants who are not incentivized to be loyal to our nation or our heritage. And maybe that's the bigger question at hand here, is if we had a nation that was pushing immigrants towards a loyalty, a respect, a more assimilation to the American way, however you want to define that, like we used to, you may not have the same concerns with a non-citizen becoming a police officer. But because of the trend that we're having, where increasingly immigrants are not assimilating or forming their own communities and their own cultures, this becomes a scarier thing.
Yeah, and I think that's where, honestly, Republicans have to do a better job, is of outlining traditional American values. Because oftentimes we fall into the trap of, we say traditional American values, and the Democrat retort is, "Oh, you wanted to go back to the 50s and the 60s," and it's like,
in some ways,
yeah. I mean, there's some things that were good about that, but then obviously, like the civil rights movement was important, like all these things that make today's world very different and inclusive. And I don't know that the Republican Party has yet really defined that, because we keep falling into that trap of, when we say traditional American values, they go, well, you just want to go back. We have to, as Republicans now, carve that out, that this is what America should be. And that rabbit hole gets deep, because they go, well, what are traditional American values? Because you have people from all over that made America. It's melting pot, all these things. And there are certain things that are true that we, as a people, without talking to each other, probably believe in inherently. And we have to do a better job of bringing those things to the forefront.
Yeah. No, I think we are automatically always put on the defensive, right? Because you're saying, the first thing is, you really like Jim Crow, or you really, right. Or you really liked, the segregated counters those were always it's always a bad faith conversation. So at this point in my life and in our political discourse, whenever anybody brings that up, they're not the person that is going to ever take your conversation seriously, right? But there are a lot of people out there that are winnable, that are more open to those things. So I think you're definitely right that not just on this issue of traditional values, on most issues, the GOP has done a horrible job marketing its platforms, right? Because you look at, we want traditional American values. Oh, well, so you want to bring back lynch mobs? Well, no. Right. We want. You could say things like, well, we want a strong border. Oh, so you hate immigrants? Right. We're a nation of immigrants. All these different things. We don't think that we believe in the right to life. Oh, so you don't think women should have autonomy over their own bodies? It's always we're always on the defensive about everything, usually against people who are putting forward bad faith arguments, that I think it derails our ability to be able to, or it has derailed our ability to be able to articulate the pros, because we're always on the defense.
And I think that's how you ended up ultimately with a guy like Donald Trump, right? Is because he's a marketer in and of itself. Yeah. So he came in with a very simple message and marketed the hell out of it. Yeah. Make America great. And that resonated with people, because the GOP has done such a poor job of branding its assets over time.
Yeah, and also he was the first Republican in my lifetime to really not go on the defensive to the media.
Yeah.
Right. When the media tried to put those labels, you're racist. There's that great video when he's like, there's a reporter that's like, how do you respond to the allegations or the people saying you're racist? He's like, I'm the least racist person you've ever met.
right,
and he walks away. And that was what was refreshing to a lot of people was like, finally, we're not on the defense. We're going on offense, which is ultimately how we're going to repair the what's going on in this country. Now, to get into a final topic, something that is kind of comical when was talked about, but I want to actually maybe take it a little bit seriously from a deeper perspective, and that is who's controlling our weather. Because I don't know what the heck's going on. We're always pretending like I don't know what's going on as far as you could tell me anything. If somebody came in this room right now and told me that Joe Biden has a switch in his bedroom that controls hurricanes, nothing would shock me at this point. I am beyond shock in this world. I just am. But there was this whole man-made hurricane. You can call it conspiracy theory. I stopped calling things conspiracy theories because so many conspiracy theories have come true. But there was the man-made hurricane theory about Hurricane Milton, and I didn't personally buy into it. I don't think there's man-made hurricanes, but maybe I'll let you clear your name a little bit, Ken. Are you the one controlling the weather?
I actually put this one out. Okay. I said, if I can change the climate, I can make a hurricane. No, so, I mean, look, again, to your point, like, quit calling things conspiracies because a lot of the times they end up being true. And I'm hesitant to even get involved in conspiracy at this point because Alex Jones is a conspiracy theorist for a living and then got sued for talking about conspiracies.
I like the whole the put another penny in the quarter in the Alex Jones was right jar because there's so many conspiracy theories that he's been involved in.
Oh yeah.
But there's a number that he's been right. It's like the turning the frogs gay one that everybody made fun of.
One.
But actually there's chemicals in the water that have turned frogs transgender. So he was actually right.
Right.
And he was made fun of relentlessly for that one specifically.
Yep.
There's some other ones that I don't buy into. Maybe I'll get proven wrong, but I find some of them find it funny when all of a sudden something comes out and Alex Jones is like, I said this 15 years ago.
Yeah, he's a character for sure, but he has been right a number of times. No, I think the interesting thing about this in general is, it's kind of hit the news cycle and they instantly say, oh, you're stupid if you believe this sort of thing. The fact is, though, we have been geoengineering weather patterns, like through cloud seeding. Like that's a real thing that happens in the U.S. Like in places where there's drought, we figured out how to put liquid silver into the atmosphere and make it rain. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that we could have some kind of impact on weather patterns. I don't buy into this one in particular. But,
and I think there's it's not. It would actually be very reasonable to believe that the government would be working on technology to be able to manipulate the weather. Because if you are, just think about military research.
Everything's a weapon.
Right? If you're able to cause a drought or a natural disaster against a rival nation that you may be at war with, you're going to want to be able to do that. So the thought that this would never even enter the equation, I think, is silly. And that's where I have I get very frustrated with the talking heads on TV or any of the experts where they pretend like none of these things are so outside the realm of possibility when they're clearly not. Like this, Tennessee voted to ban the geoengineering. And it's funny, in the same article, NBC News, it says with allusions to chemtrails conspiracy theory. But then you look at New Mexico, this is New Mexico political report. House passes cloud seeding pilot project bill. They voted 61-6 to do more of this, to fund it at a larger degree. So
I mean, they can make it rain in Dubai.
Right.
It doesn't rain there.
So there is obviously abilities to do things. There's obviously things going on that we don't understand. We weren't allowed to talk about this. All the people, I used to think people talking about chemtrails are crazy and that this cloud seeding stuff was all just conspiracy theory. I used to think that. I just didn't think much of it. But there's now all of a sudden we're talking about it in the open, like it's, and that's always the cycle. It's these things aren't happening, and then it goes to these things are happening, but it's a good thing that they're happening, and you're an idiot if you don't want them to happen. Yeah. So I think that it's the hurricanes. And to get into the deeper issue here, I didn't bring this up to talk about man-made weather, although it's very interesting. I brought this up because we are now in a position where anything that happens of significance, there's a conspiracy theory around it, whether it turns out to be true or false. Anything that happens. We used to be a very high-trust society. We used to have a very high trust in the media. There's actually, if you especially look at our older generations, they have a much higher trust in the media. They're the ones who are much more likely to watch their local news or continue to turn on CNN or Fox News because they have this built-in trust when you thought you're turning on the news to hear the news and hear what happened. But we live in this society now where we've been so trained by our experiences to be distrustful of our experts, of our media, that anything that happens, we automatically assume that there is some foul play.
Well, we've just been lied to so many times.
Yeah. So many
times. I go back to just the debate, and they're talking about Tim Walz, and specifically on CNN, I was watching at the time, and they talked about, Walz has a tendency to exaggerate or sometimes embellish the truth. They did everything but call them lies.
Yeah.
And it's like the word is lies.
Right, yeah.
They said they used 4 different synonyms for lies, and I'm like, you're talking about a guy that's just not telling the truth. Like this, you will say anything to not call him a liar.
Right. And it's like, if you look at even like the fact checking institutions like Snopes or PolitiFact, going back to the JD Vance statistic, if they would post on there, if there's, he claimed there are 85,000 children of illegal immigrants in Michigan schools, they would say mostly false. There's 84,999, right? They would say this was a lie. So everything is manipulated and screwed to the point where most people, the assumption is if these people tell me something, the opposite is true. And I can't blame anybody for thinking that at this point. I can't blame anybody for, and I'm the type of person where, like I said to start this subject, nothing would shock me, nothing would surprise me. I'm now at the point where I'm saying maybe that is the case. I'm going to wait to maybe learn more about it. I'm going to digest the info as it comes, and I'm not going to even make a declaration of do I believe this is true or false on a lot of things, because a lot of time we all like to jump to the conclusions of what's the most politically advantageous, right? What aids in our side of the story, and I understand the inclination for that, but there's no reason to put trust in these people, because like you've said, in every major situation in our lifetime, we've been lied to. And you look at 9/11 conspiracy theories and things of that nature, we are now 23 years separated from 9/11, and there's more individuals now that believe that there was foul play that goes, and I think that's growing by the year because we have gotten so distrustful of our institutions to the fact that we would actively believe that our own government would actively or at least allow thousands of Americans to perish to move forward a certain agenda. And I can't blame anybody who really believes those things, I guess, is where I'm at.
Well, yeah, I mean, the scary thing is that you start to lose the objective truth to things because there are certain things that are true, but the problem is we have these politicians, and you see it in every debate and every stump speech where they go, well, 9 out of 10 economists agree that my platform is going to decrease the deficit. Well, my 9 out of 10 economists disagree. They think theirs is going to blow up the deficit. It's like, who are these people? We're constantly told, the science is settled or all of the experts agree. And the thing is like, that's just never been the case. That's how society progresses. It's how the medical community progresses. It's how the scientific community is, by constantly questioning the status quo. But at the same time, you also have to have some semblance of what is objectively true. It's like I was watching some UFC fighter on a podcast that said, I can prove to you that the Earth's not spinning. You get in a helicopter, you go up 15,000 feet, you sit there for 4 hours and hover, you come back down, you're going to land in the same spot. It's like, okay, well, there's actually a rational explanation here, but not in this guy's mind.
Yeah.
You lose the objective truth because so much has been lied about and made to be, well, if you don't believe this, you just are wrong.
Yeah, and I think that what this illustrates of, like you talked about, 9 out of 10 scientists agree this, 97% of scientists say this, and then 5 years later, it's something else, right? We learned that that's totally false.
Coffee's bad for you. Eggs are good for you. Coffee's good for you. Eggs are bad for you.
Exactly. So there's never a replacement for individual logic and critical thinking, I think, is the lesson that we have to take out of what's going on in the media, what goes on with these conspiracy theories is usually when I evaluate a conspiracy theory, I look at it, does this make sense logically? Would they do this? And if they would do it logically, for example, there's an individual that I knew who was very adamant that Joe Biden had a body double. Maybe he does, like I said. Nothing would shock me anymore. But what I said was, if you had a body double that could speak on a regular basis and was articulate and didn't act like a dementia patient, wouldn't you just trot that guy out all the time?
Every time, yeah.
So that was just step A in the logic test to where I said, I don't think that that's true.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong. But at the end of the day, those are the things that I think that's the function in our brains as Americans that we've turned off more than anything else is our ability to just take something, look at it logically and say, does this make sense or does this not make sense? And then make life decisions based on that. Instead, we've said, like with COVID, what are the experts saying? What are the experts saying? What's Dr. Fauci saying? What's Dr. Virch saying? What is Andrew Cuomo going to say to me on TV? Like that guy has any more understanding of COVID than you would have. Those are the type of things where the logic, the critical thinking, those are just indispensable elements of living in a republic, living in a democratic society, because as soon as you forfeit those things, you find yourself in a situation like we are now. And I think that might be the best way to cap off our calibration here today.
Love it.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it as always.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Now we're going to get into our uncomfortable truth. Today's uncomfortable truth, I'm going to get really uncomfortable. And this is a conversation that, again, the theme is going to be conversations we don't want to have, I don't want to have as a person, you don't want to have as a person, we don't want to have as a nation, but we must have if we're going to solve any of the problems that are in front of us right now. We talked about the vice presidential debate, and there was this moment in the vice presidential debate where we talked about gun control, as we do over the course of all of our debates, because unfortunately it's a true epidemic around this country of people losing their lives. And Tim Walz went into this diatribe talking about the nation of Finland and how Finland has a relatively high gun ownership rate compared to the rest of Europe, yet they have a very low gun homicide rate. And he closed out this segment on gun control by saying sometimes it's just the guns. It's just the guns. Now, anybody who owns a gun knows it's an inanimate object. It's not going to ever get up on its own and shoot anybody, right? We've had guns in this nation for our entire existence. We've always had an extremely high gun ownership rate, yet we've never seen the school shootings. We've never seen the type of violence like we've seen today. We can talk about the SSRIs. We can talk about Big Pharma. We can talk about putting these 6-year-olds on ADHD medication. We can talk about all of that, but I want to focus in on how can we have a more intelligent and a more productive conversation about what is really going on in the United States. To put this in perspective, in Finland, the homicide rate is 3.3. The gun homicide rate is 3.3 per 100,000. In the United States, it is 5.9 per 100,000. So nearly double. In the United States, it's nearly a double gun homicide rate than that of Finland. So you have to say to yourself, wow, well, yeah, it is a lot more dangerous than to be that I'm going to wind up getting shot in the United States than in Finland. But that doesn't paint the entire picture. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, and this is where I would be called a racist or a terrible person just for reciting statistics. In the United States, As I said, in Finland, the gun homicide rate is 3.3 per 100,000. It's held up as one of the safest nations in the world. In the United States, in the white community, the gun homicide rate is 1.7 per 100,000, half of that of Finland. In the Hispanic community, it's 6.4, and in the black community, it is 19.8. So we are held up as one of the most dangerous countries in the world. If you're looking to avoid getting shot by a gun, you better avoid the United States. Well, Finland is held up, along with other Nordic countries, as the safest communities that you can find. Well, in a white community in the United States, you are half as likely to get shot than that of Finland and many of these Nordic countries. In fact, if you removed Hispanic and black gun homicides, the United States would be one of the safest countries in the world. This conversation is not to propose any kind of policy or initiative, but it's to have an honest conversation of what is driving the gun epidemic, the gun violence epidemic in the United States, because we are not having an honest conversation. If we were truly going to have an honest conversation, we would talk about that in the United States, we have a 57% white population with 15.6% foreign-born immigrants, which is on pace to reach 82.2 million foreign-born individuals by 2040, unsustainable in and of itself. And you're talking about Finland, where 90% of the people have a Finnish background in a nation of just 5.6 million people. We talk about all the time of diversity being our strength, but if you look around the globe, the most homogenous populations are the safest, have the best healthcare systems, have the best education systems. So this isn't me making accusations. This isn't me casting blame even necessary. This is me saying we have to have an honest conversation about the communities that are driving the gun epidemic, and we have to put responsibility at the feet of people who must own that responsibility, who are going to be the ones who have to correct that problem. Because if we just continue to approach this subject from the U.S. has a gun violence epidemic, but we refuse to acknowledge the fact that our white communities in the United States are some of the safest in the world, we're not talking about the real problem. And increasingly around the country, increasingly in our crime statistics, you're seeing Hispanics lumped in with whites, which is manipulating the statistics at large. So my uncomfortable truth here is that we don't have a gun violence problem in the United States. And in fact, if we want to solve the problem, if we had politicians and individuals and our organizations who wanted to solve this problem, we'd have an honest conversation about where to start. But that's not where our government is right now. And I don't blame any politician. This is a difficult conversation to have. But if we're going to turn around America, we're going to have to start having these difficult conversations and uncovering these uncomfortable truths. So thank you for joining me here today. I'm Jonah Schultz. This is Man in the Arena. Make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
If I can change, я думаю, что каждый тоже изменился. And you can change. Вы можете измениться. Everybody can change.